All right, we're going to pick up talking about the presidency in terms of some of his interests and his leadership style. So let's think about, as president, what are the different roles? And so each one of these talks about how the president fits a particular role. So, and sometimes he's chief of state. He is also the chief diplomat in terms of our relations with other countries. He is the commander-in-chief, leads the military. He is considered the moral leader of the nation. He's the party leader, so Barack Obama is the leader of the Democratic Party. He's the chief executive. He is the top dog in the executive office. He is the person who's supposed to deal with managing our prosperity. And he's also the crisis leader, and I have that highlighted because I just want to show you a couple of ways that the president is seen as the leader in a crisis situation, because we can put a face with the crisis. When we think about congressional leaders as crisis managers, we don't have that same idea in our minds. And so if we think back to 9/11, this is an iconic picture of George Bush a few days after 9/11 visiting the World Trade Center with the individuals who were trying to deal with the aftermath. And so this is when he got on his bullhorn and talked to the masses that were there trying to help, and was talking to the different firefighters and police and construction workers after 9/11. And so his role is to be the face of the response of a crisis, try to unify the nation, give people comfort in their mourning, and this is what a leader does during a crisis situation. A more recent example was Barack Obama speaking after the shooting in Arizona that wounded Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, who was recuperating in Houston for a long time. And this is his role as an individual to try and comfort those who are affected by something as monumental as an assassination attempt. And you can see here is the picture of Gabriella Giffords' husband, who just retired. He was an astronaut. And so this is an important element. The leader of the country is supposed to be the person who is out front during a crisis situation. And Obama did a good job of this during this particular event and other events where there have been crises. And most presidents generally fulfill this role pretty well. All right. Well, what are the goals and interests of presidents? If you are going to become president, think about this as the goal of the presidency. It's the interest of the office, not particularly the interest of the actual occupant. So what do we want to see in the presidency? What are the goals and the interests of the president as president? The first thing is that presidents want to leave the powers of the presidency as great, if not greater, than when they entered the office. So presidents don't come into the Oval Office and think, gee, I hope I leave the office with less presidential powers than I started with. They want more presidential power. And so they never want to try to seem as someone trying to abdicate their authority. And this is another reason why we've seen the growth of the presidency in terms of power since the founding of the Constitution. Another goal is we want to maintain U.S. leadership on key issues. So leadership in terms of dealing with the Middle East, leadership issues in terms of the war on terror. And over the last decade, there has been discussion about whether or not the United States is really still the leader on these key issues. One of the areas that I deal with is the human rights issue, and many people don't think that the United States is leading in the area of human rights because of our reluctance to sign on to certain human rights documents and treaties, and as well as the war on terror. So one of the goals of the president is to make sure that we are maintaining that leadership on key issues. The goal of the presidency is to make sure the presidency itself appears strong, as well as the United States. Traditionally, leaders wanted to avoid war. It's seen as a successful presidency and successful leadership if you could steer clear of war. But we tend to think of this in different ways now. There is a difference between a war of choice and a war of necessity. And so if we think about the wars that we've been in lately, this idea to avoid a war really kind of stemmed from the Vietnam era. If we think about the last war of necessity, most people talk about World War II as a war of necessity to make sure that fascism, Hitler, did not win that particular war, as opposed to a war of choice. And many people look toward the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, as a war of choice. And so now we're talking about, leaders are talking about what to do about Iran. And so would a war in Iran, for example, be a war of necessity or a war of choice? And depending upon your political viewpoint, these wars might have been a war of choice, or they might have been a war of necessity. And this is a personal view, but it's also debated amongst policy wonks and people who are observers of policy about the whole issue of war. And it's an interesting topic to debate in general. All right. Well, how do leaders lead? There are about 3 different models of presidential leadership that I want to point out to you. And this is not provided in your book that much. I think your book talks more about stewardship and what the role of a good steward is. So I want to outline for you these 3 different models of presidential decision making. There's the presidential leadership model that's reflected more by Alexander Hamilton, that's him on the right. There is the executive/party model that's more in line with a Jeffersonian point of view. And then there is an executive congressional model that is more in line with a Madisonian or James Madison's point of view. So let's just talk about the first one, this idea of presidential leadership. This is the idea of a leadership model that favors strong and energetic executives. So if we think about Abraham Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt, these are the idea of a strong presidential model. It's also known as a Hamiltonian model. And the idea is that presidents rely on their power of persuasion, their power of influence. So influence is the power to persuade. And the idea is that presidents derive their power not from what's in the Constitution or not in the trappings of the White House as an institution, but more from his ability to persuade and influence people. And so the office, if we think about the office and duties of the president and what constitutionally their job is, it's designed to make him weak and inefficient. And remember, this is what the original framers wanted. So the president has to employ his professional reputation, his public prestige as leverage or bargaining tools to deal with all the different demands that are placed in him. So in the presidential leadership model, the president's going to go out and use his power of persuasion, perhaps with the general public. The president has a lot of free press, a lot of free time on the television or the internet now, or through tweets, that he's able to speak to the general public, who will then influence Congress to try and get the policies passed that the president wants. So the idea is that the president must continually search for information that provides him with the different choices and the different alternative actions to take in order to persuade or influence. So ultimately the president can rely only on himself to provide this necessary information in order to make for prudent decisions. And so in this model, and this is very much what Hamilton wanted, was a very strong executive pressuring, persuading, cajoling, bargaining, and influencing others to get what they want. And the whole idea is that you need to protect your power from Congress's power, and you want to maintain control of everything. So image is everything. And so the presidential model is characterized by flexibility, speed, control of information, assertiveness. And many people argue that this is a model that describes the U.S. presidency up until about Watergate, where the abuse of presidential power really hit the institution of the presidency hard. Okay? And this is the idea of stewardship. Stewardship theory calls for a strong, assertive presidential role. And this presidential view is prevalent today, because it's argued that a strong president is needed to respond to national and foreign crises. And a large and active government is where a president has a lot of authority because he has a lot of tools at his disposal. And also, under this role, the president is the foreign policy leader for the United States. And the nation is important politically, militarily, and economically in the international arena. And so if you're a strong president, you're able to influence all these different areas much more freely and much more efficiently if you have a strong leadership model. The critique, of course, is that if you have too much dominance by the presidents, you get into abusive situations like the Iran-Contra, like Vietnam. And so Congress has tried to be much more assertive since the Watergate era, usually in their ability to call on their oversight function that we talked about when we talked about the legislative branch. All right. The executive party model, think of the Jeffersonian idea of politics, where you want an executive and you want the party to work together in order to put forth policies. So this particular model is characterized by strong teamwork, by this idea of majoritarianism, and the idea that the party is going to be responsible for a lot of the policies that is put forth in order for the president to lead. Here the president is acting upon his role as party chief that I talked about a while ago, and this requires a strong party, however. The problem in American politics with a strong party and the reliance on party structure is that we have a weak party structure in America. Okay, so this is due to our party structure, due to the fact that we have an electoral system that is first past the post, and it's also a function of the fact that Americans tend to distrust this organization, this perception of a party. Okay, so if we have weak parties in America, which we do, the executive party model isn't very efficient. And so this isn't a model that many presidents have found to be successful. Okay, the last time that we had a president that was the party chief and head of a strong party was Woodrow Wilson back at the turn of the previous century leading up to World War I. All right, then that leaves us with the executive congressional model. And this is much more of the Madisonian model, which relies upon the idea of checks and balances. And remember, James Madison was the author of the Constitution, so the idea of this checks and balances between the different branches of government was important to him. And so his vision is that you have checks and balances between the executive and the congressional branches of government, that this is going to be able to protect minority rights, it's going to be a protection against tyrannical majority rule, and it's going to provide for limited government. And the advantage is it's much more constitutional, and it's conducive to divided rule, where you have one party in charge of the executive branch and another party dominating in Congress. And this fits more into the Whig theory of presidential or national leadership, where the presidency was limited or restrained by the constitutional role as well as the role of the other branch of government, in this case the legislative branch. Okay, so that's three different roles of the presidential leadership. We can pretty much discount the executive party model because we don't have strong parties. And so we kind of vacillate between the presidential leadership model and the executive congressional models. Of course, the president would prefer this leadership model, but if they don't have the power or the influence to rule, or they're not a strong personality, sometimes the executive congressional model is the one that's most evident in the U.S. situation. All right, well, what's going to make some presidents more successful than others? What contributes to presidential success? And there's a variety of ways that we can think about presidential success. And one is there a crisis? Even though crises are obviously detrimental to the country as a whole, the better the president deals with the crises, the more success they're going to have. So think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy was eventually successful with that particular crisis, and this kind of bolstered his ability to lead. If you're not successful in a crisis situation, if we think about George Bush and Katrina, then your presidential success or your ability to succeed as president is going to be diminished. Okay. Another factor that leads to your level of presidential success is the stage of your presidency. If we think about a 4-year term, that first several months is known as the honeymoon phase. And this is the phase of the presidency where they believe that they've been elected through a mandate, that this is what the people want, and they're going to try and shove a lot of legislative initiatives through the Congress in order to get passage early on. The longer you're in office, the less likely you are to be successful. Now, if you won a second term, then you have a second honeymoon phase because you're making the argument as president, not only do they like me once, but they like me again, so I'm going to shove through all my particular policy initiatives. But at some point, you become the lame duck. And that means that you're term limited. You can't run for president again. And so that last several months and the last year of your presidency, you may not be able to get anything passed because Congress is simply going to wait you out until a new president is in office. So the stage of the presidency matters. Then there's the issue, are you talking about foreign policy or domestic policy? And this is the idea that over the course of U.S. history, presidents have been more successful with foreign policy than domestic policy. And that's because when we think about foreign policy, we tend to have in our minds a common enemy. And unfortunately, the American public has very little knowledge and sometimes interest in foreign policy. And so the president is seen as more of a leader in this area, with little or no opposition, particularly during the Cold War, where there was something called a Cold War consensus, where we could squabble all day long about things that are going on domestically, but when it comes to fighting communism, we were allied or united in that effort. Think about squabbling amongst your siblings. My brother and I could fight each other till we almost killed each other, and that was fine. That was our domestic argument. But as someone started picking on us from the outside, then we closed ranks and provided a united front. That's pretty much the same that's going on for the president. So in terms of domestic policy, there's much more debate, there's much more congressional action, and so the president is probably less successful on domestic policy than in foreign policy. Then it depends upon his relationship with Congress. If the president is dealing with a Congress where the leadership in Congress is of the same political party that he is, he's probably going to be more successful. But a president who's facing a divided Congress or divided government, then he's dealing with the opposition party and probably isn't going to be as successful getting his legislative initiatives passed. So it depends upon what kind of relationship has the president developed with Congress. Obviously, public opinion matters. What is his level of public support? If the president is not getting any public support, he's not going to be successful because Congress is not going to be concerned about going up against the president if the president doesn't have popular support. We think a good example of this is during George Bush Sr. If you think about the time when the first Gulf War occurred in 1991, he came out of that time period with a very high public opinion rating in the 90 percentile. So in the early months of 1991 into the summer of 1991, George Bush had a high approval rating, but somehow managed to lose the election less than a year later to Bill Clinton. And it's because he lost public support on the economy. So you have to maintain your level of public support in order to be successful. And then what is your relationship with the media? If you want a favorable relationship with the media, then you have to be willing and able to deal with them on a regular basis. This gets into the issue of whether or not the media is biased toward the Democratic Party. Do they treat Barack Obama the same way they treated George Bush? And so sometimes your party affiliation might define your relationship with the media. There are candidates and there are legislators who will only appear on CNN or will only appear on Fox because they think that particular media has a different level of viewership. And so ultimately, if we think about what determines the level of success of a president, it's these things combined. And we think about whether or not, in terms of leadership, these different external circumstances are going to matter. Is it a time of crisis? Presidents can wield enormous influence during times of crisis, and their capacity to lead tends to diminish during normal circumstances. You have to think about what the presidential term is. It's in these different stages. So the honeymoon period for most presidents is a time when quick and decisive action may occur. And conversely, presidents are not as effective later in their term of office. And presidents tend to have more power and influence in foreign affairs than in domestic affairs. In terms of congressional support, it's becoming and remaining an important issue to be a successful president. Okay, so if you veto the president, if you veto congressional legislation all the time, this might change your relationship with Congress. So presidents must utilize the power to persuade, particularly if they're dealing with divided government. And presidents are more successful if they treat members of Congress as a constituency, responding to their interests and their needs. When it comes to public support, it has a major effect on the president's ability to lead and attain policy goals. The public tends to attribute economic downturns to the presidency, thus lowering their overall public confidence in that institution. So voters tend to be retrospective when it comes to voting. So this is why one of the questions that will come up about the economy is they might ask, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? If you're not better off, blame the president. Okay, so again, the public tends to attribute bad economic times to the president, and this is going to lower their overall confidence in the presidency. And over time, presidential approval ratings usually decrease. And the personal character of the president has some impact on that particular measure. Conversely, an international crisis nearly always increases the approval rating in the short term, as I mentioned with George Bush. But over time, that will diminish. And during time of war, what you see is initial support, that rally around the flag effect, but as more and more people die in war, that leads to a decrease in the public support. And modern presidents must use television, must use the media. Now they must be attuned to social media. Okay? And so the major advantage is the president is guaranteed TV time in order to go what's called going public. They can bypass Congress and appeal directly to the American people. So the presidents must put their spin on the news to counter whatever negativity might be coming forth from the media. Okay? So in the end, the factors that are important in a president's success includes the presence or absence of national conditions that require strong leadership, the stage of the president's term, the strength of the president's party in Congress, and the focus of the policy issue. Is it domestic policy? Is it foreign policy? All right, I want to say just a few things about the president's staff. Okay, this is the executive branch. Okay, there's lots of different people that belong to the president, to the executive branch. You have the staff that works for the president. Okay, and so those people are important. These are the people who work in the executive branch in the White House, for example. And there's a lot of people who are appointed. And so all these people over here, for example, are appointed. But appointees are an important source of information and allow the president to extend their influence into the bureaucracy. Okay? And in this bureaucracy, the president has surrounded himself with a large staff of advisors, policy experts, and other managers to help meet and fulfill the obligations of the president. Okay? So let's just look a little bit about these different individuals. Again, I'm not going to point out any staff members, but let's talk about some of these agencies and the vice president, for example. One agency to keep in mind is the Executive Office of the President. That's the EOP. This is his personal bureaucracy. It includes the National Security Council, the White House Office, the Council of Economic Advisors, and the Office of Management and Budget. And these are the individuals who are going to help the president run the day-to-day activities of the executive branch. The vice president has no constitutional authority of its own. However, recent presidents have given vice presidents important responsibilities. Okay, so there is some role for the vice president. Okay, so if we think about the vice presidency, obviously they're first in line of succession. But many people kind of think of the vice presidency as someone who's just in waiting. They're like the heir in waiting. And here's some quotes regarding the VP. John Adams, who is the first vice president, said, "It is the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." So you can see that John Adams didn't think much of his job as vice president. John Garner, who was the nation's 32nd vice president under FDR, is best known for his quote, "The vice presidency isn't worth a pitcher of warm spit." Okay. And then Spiro Agnew, who was a disgraced vice president of Richard Nixon, said, "A little over a week ago, I took a rather unusual step for a vice president. I said something." Okay. So over time, there's this idea that the vice president doesn't have a lot of roles to play. But in the modern era, the vice president has been given certain types of duties to focus on. So for George Bush, his vice president, Dick Cheney, was seen as someone who had a lot of foreign policy experience, so he's very instrumental in the war on terror. The current vice president, Joseph Biden, deals a lot with economic issues. He spent a lot of time in the Senate, and so he advises the president on a lot of different issues in that way. This is the line of succession. So if something happens to the president, then the vice president accedes to the office. If for whatever reason the president and the vice president die simultaneously in some sort of either attack or they, I don't know, spontaneously combust, then the person who becomes president is Speaker of the House, and this is this man right here, John Boehner, who is currently Speaker of the House. In case something happens to all three of them, then the President pro temp. This is the President pro temp right now, who is a Democrat from the state of Hawaii. This is primarily a honorary position. It goes to the senator with the most seniority, and his job is to deal with the rules of the Senate and act as the gavel holder, if you will, in the Senate. Then the fourth in line is Secretary of State, and that is Hillary Clinton right now. The fifth in line is Secretary of the Treasury. This is Gaitner at the moment. And then Secretary of Defense, Panetta. Okay? And then you can see as you go down the line who's next in line to be president in terms of the presidential line of succession. Okay. All right. Well, that concludes part one of the lecture on the presidency. Part two is going to focus more on the president's powers and how they're outlined in the Constitution and how they are really applied in practice.